The night the city marked her as empty, Liana Cross felt it before anyone told her. It arrived as a pressure change, subtle and wrong, like a storm forming where the sky still looked clear. The air around her tightened, sounds dulled, and the familiar undercurrent that hummed beneath the city's skin slipped past her without leaving a trace. In a place where power answered blood, her blood answered nothing. That silence was not absence. It was rejection. She stood on the balcony of the Hale residence, high above streets that never truly slept, watching the city breathe. Neon reflected off wet asphalt, red and blue lights stroking the facades of old buildings claimed long ago by night clans whose names never appeared on official maps. This city functioned because they allowed it to. Law enforcement, financial institutions, private security, political donors, everything intersected somewhere beneath the surface, where agreements were sealed without witnesses and broken only once. Liana had grown up knowing this order the way other children learned prayers. She had simply never been allowed to belong to it. From childhood, she had been labeled carefully. Not defective, not cursed, just empty. A woman born among bloodlines who never manifested the thing that defined them. No shift, no resonance, no ancestral echo. The clans called it an anomaly, something that occurred rarely and was corrected quietly through marriages, relocations, or disappearance. Liana's family had chosen marriage, a clean solution, a respectable one. Mark Hale had been the logical choice. He came from a secondary lineage with ambition sharp enough to cut through ceilings built for him by others. He was not an alpha, not yet, but he was ascending. Strategic, disciplined, and ruthless in a way that passed for stability. Their union was announced as a strengthening of alliances, a symbol of continuity. To the city, Liana became a visual reassurance. The composed wife, the unremarkable woman who softened Mark's edges and made him appear safe for power. Inside the house, however, she had always felt like furniture that had been carefully chosen to complete a room. Useful, neutral, replaceable. The shift happened slowly enough that no one could be accused of cruelty. Mark's attention did not vanish, it thinned. His presence became procedural. Meetings replaced meals. Touches turned incidental, then rare, then absent. Decisions were made around her instead of with her. Invitations stopped arriving in her name and started arriving addressed only to him. When she spoke, people listened politely, then looked to Mark for confirmation that her words mattered. She noticed the first real fracture the night the physician closed the file. The conclusion had been delivered without ceremony, without sympathy, and without options. In women like Liana, fertility was considered a given, even without manifested power. Her condition removed the last justification for patience. The city did not punish infertility, it simply recalculated value. By the time she returned home that evening, the house already felt altered. The walls were the same. The security systems hummed as always. But something essential had shifted, as if an invisible seal had been broken and the structure no longer recognized her authority to exist within it. She moved through rooms she had furnished and curated, feeling the strange sensation of trespassing in her own life. Mark did not confront her. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He adjusted. From that point on, she was excluded from the future with quiet efficiency. Long-term plans were discussed in rooms she was no longer invited into. Renovations were proposed that removed spaces she favored. Her schedule became irrelevant to his. The absence of conflict was the conflict. Liana understood the language being spoken. She had been raised among it. A woman without power could still serve as a symbol. A woman without heirs could not. The city noticed before she did. At gatherings, conversations stalled when she approached. Eyes slid away too quickly. Scents shifted, subtle tells among those trained to read danger and opportunity in the same breath. She was no longer a protected object. She was a liability waiting to be resolved. What unsettled her most was not the rejection, but the relief she felt beneath it. For the first time in her life, the expectations pressing against her skin began to loosen. She no longer had to perform usefulness, no longer had to soften herself into something palatable. The emptiness everyone feared in her had always been there. Now it had space to expand. Late at night, alone in the wing of the house Mark had already begun to abandon, Liana found herself listening to the city differently. She noticed how certain streets went silent at specific hours, how patrol routes bent around buildings that officially did not matter, how some lights flickered when she passed beneath them, not in recognition, but in uncertainty. It was as if the world itself did not know where to place her anymore. That should have frightened her. Instead, it sharpened her. She began to realize that being empty in a system built on blood made her something else entirely. Not weak, unaligned, unpredictable. The clans relied on patterns, on inheritance, on repetition. Liana was none of those things. The night she accepted that truth, the city answered in a way she did not expect. A name surfaced where it should not have. A sealed incident report. A death classified as routine, but surrounded by irregular silences. It came to her through a peripheral channel, the kind of information that usually passed beneath her notice because it was never meant for her. A woman from the inner circles had died suddenly, not publicly, not violently enough to raise questions, but deliberately obscured. And tied to that death was something that did not belong in any ledger. A responsibility. Liana did not know yet that this moment marked the end of her invisibility. She only knew that the city had finally noticed her not as a placeholder, but as a variable. She stood once more on the balcony, watching the street's pulse below, and for the first time, the silence inside her did not feel like a lack. It felt like a space waiting to be filled with consequences. Whatever the city thought it had removed from her life, it had miscalculated. Empty did not mean harmless. The call reached Liana Cross after midnight, delivered through a number that was never used for normal life. It was not a request. It was an administrative fact, spoken by a voice trained to sound neutral even when it carried a threat. By the time she put on shoes and stepped into the humid dark, the city had already moved on without her, reshaping itself around a single event on a highway outside its limits. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the streets slick and reflective. The air smelled of wet concrete and old magnolia, and the French Quarter's lights trembled in puddles like nervous hands. Liana drove without music, one palm tight on the wheel, the other resting on the seat beside her where her phone lay face down as if hiding could change what it had conveyed. She was used to being excluded from decisions, but this was different. This was the kind of call people received only when the night order needed a clean witness, or a clean scapegoat. The highway beyond the city limits felt like another country. The buildings thinned, then vanished into stretches of pine and marshland. The darkness out there was not decorative, it was functional. The clans preferred it that way because it kept accidents from becoming stories. Emergency vehicles clustered ahead like a wound that refused to close. Their lights bled red and blue across the wet road, throwing trees into sharp, unnatural relief. A section of the highway had been carved out with cones and temporary barriers, and men in black jackets moved with the synchronized efficiency of private security, not state troopers. The scene was being contained, not investigated. Liana parked where she was directed and stepped out into cold air laced with gasoline and the metallic tang of torn engine parts. The road's surface glimmered under floodlights. A sedan sat smashed against the guardrail at an angle that suggested it had not simply drifted. The front end was folded inward, and the windshield was spiderwebbed with fractures that caught the light like ice. There were no crowds, no curious drivers slowing for a look. The traffic had been diverted miles back. This was the first sign that it belonged to the night, not the city. The second sign was the salt. A thin white line had been scattered along the shoulder and around the wreck, too deliberate to be the work of road crews. It looked almost accidental, as if someone had dropped a bag and walked away. But Liana had grown up around enough ritual precautions to recognize intention when she saw it. Salt was not a symbol here. It was a boundary. It implied the presence of something that needed to be kept in or kept out. A man approached her, older, careful, his posture trained for de-escalation. His jacket carried no official insignia. He did not offer a handshake. He simply studied her face as if checking it against an internal file. Liana did not ask for details. She already felt them in the air. This scene was not for her curiosity. It was for her signature later. She was guided closer, not to the wreck itself, but to a separate vehicle parked a short distance away. The rear door opened, and a medic stepped out, adjusting gloves. The medic's eyes flicked toward Liana and then away, like someone avoiding a mirror. The small gesture lodged in her mind. In this world, certain people avoided reflective surfaces for reasons that had nothing to do with vanity. Inside the vehicle, the smell of antiseptic mixed with blood and damp wool. The lighting was too bright and too white, like a clinic designed to erase atmosphere. A body lay on a stretcher beneath a sheet pulled to the neck. The face was visible. The woman was not a stranger to the city's unseen order. She belonged to the closed circle of donors, board members, private foundations, and nameless community leaders who attended charity galas and controlled far more than they admitted. Her name circulated in whispers that never reached newspapers. She was the kind of person whose presence in a room made other people sit straighter without knowing why. Liana had seen her once before, years ago, at a fundraiser Mark Hale hosted. The woman had moved through the crowd as if the crowd were water, smiling where it served her, ignoring where it did not. Liana remembered the sensation of being looked at and dismissed in the same glance, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. Now the calculation had ended. The woman's skin had the pallor of someone whose warmth had been taken quickly. There was a faint bruise along the jawline, and one hand lay visible outside the sheet, fingers slightly curled as if the body still clung to the idea of holding something. A thin band of dried blood marked the wrist, too precise to be random. Liana recognized the line as the residue of a cut made for a reason. The accident was a story. The body was a fact. The wrist was a message. Liana's gaze dropped lower, and she saw what the rest of the scene had been hiding. A baby carrier sat in the corner of the vehicle, secured with straps as if someone had been afraid it would vanish. The infant inside was swaddled tightly in a gray blanket, face turned slightly to the side, breathing steady. The baby's eyes were open, too calm for the chaos that must have surrounded them minutes earlier. The child did not cry. The child watched. Something in Liana's chest shifted, sharp and involuntary, like a lock clicking. She had spent years being told she was a void in a system built on blood and power. Yet the child's gaze landed on her with a quiet certainty that felt almost accusatory, as if the baby could sense her difference and found it familiar. The medic watched Liana carefully, waiting for the wrong reaction. Liana did not give it. She did not reach out. She did not step back. She only stared at the infant, aware that the room had tightened around that small body. The man in the black jacket placed a folder on a metal shelf, opened it, and turned it so Liana could see. The document inside was not a standard legal form. It was a hybrid, part human law, part something older. There were notarization marks, yes, but there were also symbols embedded in the margins, pressed faintly into the paper like bruises beneath skin. The woman's last directive had been prepared before she died. That was the first impossibility. The second was the name printed in the section labeled Temporary Guardian. Liana Cross. Not Mark Hale, not a clan-appointed caretaker, not a blood relative, not anyone with rank or power. Liana. The choice was so deliberate it became suspicious. In the closed circle, nothing happened by sentiment, especially not something involving a child. Liana's mind reached for a simple explanation and found none. She had no ties to the woman, no friendship, no obligation, no shared history she could claim. The only thing she offered was the one thing the clans distrusted and could not easily control. She was outside their blood logic. She did not belong to any pack hierarchy. She did not manifest power. She had no clan scent that signaled allegiance. She was a blank space. And now that blank space had been assigned a living weight. Liana's first instinct was to refuse, not because she did not want the child, but because she understood what accepting meant. It meant stepping into a structure that had kept her at the edges until now. It meant becoming visible. Worse, it meant becoming accountable. Her second instinct was to look for the trap. The crash scene had been contained too cleanly. The salt line had been placed too deliberately. The woman's wrist bore too purposeful a mark, and the document had been ready before death could reasonably allow it. None of this belonged to chance. This was an operation. The folder included additional pages, medical summary, incident report, a sealed statement that read like a confession without admitting guilt. Liana scanned the language and saw gaps where names should have been. The woman had been traveling alone, the report claimed. She had lost control on the wet road. There had been no other vehicles involved. Yet there were tire marks on the shoulder outside, visible in the floodlights, cutting across the wet surface at an angle that did not align with a simple slide. Liana had no investigative authority, but she did not need one to see the difference between accident and forced trajectory. The baby's medical sheet was even stranger. Healthy vitals, no injuries, no signs of shock. And then, in a section that should have been irrelevant to human paperwork, a single line appeared in careful, understated phrasing. No resonance detected. It was the first time Liana saw the child described in the private language of the clans. No resonance meant no manifested power, no wolf, no gift, no ancestral flair. It was the clan world's polite way of saying defective without admitting cruelty, and in their logic, a childlike that was both worthless and dangerous. Worthless because bloodlines did not invest in weakness. Dangerous because weakness could be used. A child without power could become leverage against someone who had it, or become proof of failure for a prestigious line, or become a bargaining chip, traded quietly to settle debts no one would write down. Liana's throat tightened. She thought of her own life, years reduced to a silent label, empty, unworthy of inheritance. A woman useful only as a symbol until she failed at the one function that mattered. She understood what it meant to be a stain on someone else's reputation. Now the stain was small enough to fit in a carrier. The man in the jacket waited, patient in the way predators were patient. The medic pretended not to listen. A second security figure lingered outside the open door, scanning the highway as if expecting something to come back. Liana realized they were not asking whether she would take the child. They were documenting how she responded. Her reaction would determine what came next. If she refused, the clans would move in. The baby would vanish into an internal system of guardianships and care facilities that never appeared on records. The child would be raised as a secret or disposed of as a problem. And the woman's last directive would become meaningless, which meant the directive had never been intended to succeed. It would have been a decoy. If she accepted, she would become the directive's vehicle. The clans would have to decide whether to honor it, challenge it, or weaponize it. Liana felt the weight of those options settle onto her shoulders like wet cloth. She stepped closer to the carrier and looked down at the infant. The baby's eyes tracked her with slow focus. A tiny hand, barely more than a soft fist, shifted beneath the blanket, as if reaching for warmth without knowing where warmth would come from. Liana did not feel magic. She did not feel resonance. She felt something older and more brutal, responsibility. For years, she had lived inside Mark Hale's house and still felt like a guest. Now she was being asked to take someone smaller than herself and become their entire ground. She reached into the carrier, fingers careful, and adjusted the edge of the blanket near the baby's cheek. The skin was warm. The breath was steady. The child smelled like milk and clean fabric and something faintly metallic underneath, the lingering imprint of the accident scene. No resonance detected, yet the child's gaze held a quiet steadiness that did not belong to helplessness. Liana signed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Ink pressed into paper like a seal. The act was simple, almost mundane, yet the air in the vehicle shifted slightly as if the space acknowledged a change in ownership. The man in the jacket took the folder back and closed it with careful finality. Outside, the floodlights continued to glare. The wreck continued to sit against the guardrail, a staged corpse of a narrative. But the real event had already happened. A woman had died, and her last move had placed a child into the hands of someone the clans could not categorize. As Liana carried the baby carrier out of the vehicle, she felt eyes on her from all angles. Security, medics, men who did not breathe like normal people, people whose attention carried weight. The highway air hit her like a slap, cold and damp. In the distance, thunder rolled low, not close enough to be immediate, but close enough to promise more rain. A storm moving toward the city. Liana walked toward her car, each step measured, aware that she was crossing a line she could not uncross. The baby made a small sound, not a cry, more like a soft complaint at the motion. Liana paused, leaned slightly over the carrier and steadied it with her palm. The infant quieted. It was a tiny exchange, almost nothing, but it anchored Liana in a way she had not expected. She was no longer an object in someone else's plan. She was now holding the plan. She placed the carrier in the back seat, secured it with a belt, and sat behind the wheel. Her hands trembled only once, briefly, before she forced them still. She did not allow herself the luxury of panic. Panic belonged to people who had support systems. Liana had learned long ago to function without being rescued. As she drove back toward the city, the road felt narrower. The dark trees leaned in. The rain began again, thin at first, then heavier, tapping the windshield like impatient fingers. She checked the rearview mirror and saw the baby's face reflected faintly in the glass. The infant's eyes were open again, watching the moving darkness with calm intensity, as if the child already understood that silence was a form of survival. By the time Liana reached the edge of the city's light, she knew the clans would respond. They could not let an unaligned woman hold an unpowered child connected to a dead insider. It disrupted too many balances. It raised too many questions about why the woman had chosen her. And that was the part Liana could not ignore. The directive had not been sentimental. It had been strategic. Someone had wanted the baby outside the clan system long enough for something else to happen. Or someone had wanted Liana pulled into the game in a way she could not refuse. Or both. When Liana turned onto the street leading to the Hale residence, she did not miss the black SUV parked half a block away with its lights off. She did not miss the second vehicle farther down, idling with a driver who pretended to look at a phone. She did not miss the way the street seemed to listen. They were already watching. Inside Mark's house, she would be questioned without questions, measured without words, and weighed like a decision she had never been allowed to make before. Mark would see the child and see risk. The clans would see the child and see leverage. And somewhere beneath that, something older in the city's night order would recognize the shift that had just occurred. A woman who had been dismissed, as empty had taken possession of an asset the clans feared. Liana parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the rain. The baby stirred softly behind her. Liana breathed in, held it, and let it out slowly, as if controlling air could control consequence. Then she opened the door, stepped into the wet night, and reached for the carrier. She did not know yet which rule she had broken. She only knew that from this point on, the city would treat her as someone who could not be ignored. The house judged her before Mark Hale ever spoke. Liana Cross felt it the moment she crossed the threshold with the carrier in her hands. The security system recognized her biometric signature, but the air inside rejected her presence. The temperature felt wrong, a degree colder than it should have been, the kind of chill that came not from climate control but from withdrawal. The Hale residence had always been quiet, restrained, built to signal control rather than comfort. But now it felt actively watchful, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see whether she belonged there anymore. She moved carefully through the foyer, the soft wheels of the carrier barely making a sound against polished stone. The baby slept, oblivious to the way the house recalibrated around them. Liana noticed small details she had never paid attention to before. The placement of mirrors angled to reflect corridors rather than faces, the faint metallic scent beneath the neutral air filtration, the subtle sigils worked into the moldings that had once been decorative to her and now read as defensive. This was not a home. It was a fortified asset. Mark was not in the living room. He was not in the office. He appeared instead at the top of the staircase, already dressed, already alert, as if the night had informed him of her arrival before the door had opened. His posture was composed, but his scent carried tension sharp enough to cut. He did not look at the baby first. He looked at the carrier, then at Liana's hands, as if assessing a weapon. Nothing in his expression suggested surprise, only irritation, tightly leashed. Liana understood then that the call had reached him as well, perhaps earlier, perhaps from a different channel. The night order did not waste information, especially when it concerned risk to hierarchy. Whatever choice she had made on the highway had already been evaluated by people whose opinions mattered more than hers. She set the carrier down carefully near the base of the stairs, placing herself between it and Mark by instinct. The movement was small but decisive. It drew a line through the space that had never existed between them before. Mark descended slowly, his steps measured, controlled. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Authority in his world was not expressed through volume but through certainty. The certainty radiated from him now, heavy and immovable. The assessment happened quickly. He registered the child's presence. He noted the lack of clan scent. He recognized the implications. Liana saw it all play out behind his eyes in the space of a breath. She had watched him do this with mergers, acquisitions, political alliances. Strip variables down to threat and advantage. Eliminate ambiguity. This time, she was the ambiguity. He moved past her without touching, stopping just close enough to the carrier to confirm what he already knew. The baby stirred, but did not cry. That fact unsettled him more than noise would have. Silence in a child like this meant something he did not like to consider. Liana waited. She did not speak. She had learned long ago that explaining herself to Mark only gave him more angles to dismantle her resolve. Instead, she stood still, grounded, as if her refusal to retreat could anchor the moment. The judgment came not as an explosion, but as a recalibration. Mark's priorities reassembled themselves visibly. His marriage, his standing, his trajectory. The child intersected with all three in a way that contaminated them. He saw risk where Liana saw obligation. He saw weakness where she saw consequence. He did not ask why she had signed. He did not ask whether she understood the implications. He assumed she did not, because assuming her ignorance preserved his sense of superiority. The proposal he offered was framed as mercy. The child could be transferred, quietly. There were systems for that. Foundations, off-record guardianships, relocation arrangements. Liana would not be named. The incident would be smoothed. Her marriage could survive in altered form. She would remain protected if diminished. Mark could continue his ascent without a visible stain. It was not presented as an ultimatum. It was presented as the only rational path. Liana listened without interruption, watching his mouth move while the meaning behind his words hardened into something unrecognizable. She realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that she felt no fear. The dread she had anticipated did not arrive. Instead, there was a quiet detachment, as if she had stepped slightly outside her own life and could finally see it from a distance. This was the structure she had been living inside. This was the logic that had governed every compromise she had made since childhood. Be useful, be invisible, do not disrupt the hierarchy. The baby shifted in the carrier, a small sound escaping their throat, fragile but insistent. Liana's attention snapped to the movement instantly, her body responding before thought. She crouched slightly, adjusting the blanket, her fingers steady, her touch precise. The child settled again. When she straightened, she knew the answer had already been given. She refused. Not dramatically, not loudly. The refusal manifested in stillness, in the way she did not reach for Mark's reassurance or attempt to negotiate. It appeared in the way she stood between him and the child without apology. The refusal was absolute. Mark's expression hardened. For the first time in years, he looked at her not as a partner or an inconvenience, but as an obstacle. The house responded. The ambient systems shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Access permissions changed. Doors that had once opened automatically hesitated. The residents began to withdraw recognition from her presence, just as the city had earlier that night. This was how exile worked in their world, not with guards and proclamations, but with quiet revocation. Mark did not raise his voice. He did not threaten her physically. He did something far more final. He removed protection. The implications cascaded instantly through Liana's mind. Without his name attached to hers, she lost not just status but shielding. The clans tolerated her existence because she belonged to someone. Outside that structure, she became exposed. A woman without power holding a child without power connected to a dead insider was not just vulnerable. She was provocative. She understood that leaving meant stepping into a vacuum where anything could reach her. She also understood that staying meant surrendering the last decision she would ever be allowed to make. The choice was not heroic. It was not noble. It was simply necessary. Liana moved with calm efficiency. She did not argue. She did not plead. She retrieved what she needed with the speed of someone who had never truly settled. Essentials, documents, the items she could carry without assistance. She ignored the rest. Furniture, clothing she would not need, objects that belonged to the life she was exiting. The house watched her pack without interference. That, too, was a message. Mark had already decided she was no longer worth the effort of restraint. As she moved through the rooms, Liana felt the weight of eyes on her from places she could not see. Surveillance was no longer passive. The clans were alert now. The child had changed the calculus, and Mark's rejection had broadcast her vulnerability like a signal flare. She secured the baby first, checking straps, checking breath, checking warmth. The carrier felt heavier than before, not physically but symbolically. This was no longer just a responsibility. It was a declaration. When she returned to the foyer, Mark was no longer there. He had withdrawn to a space she could not access, perhaps already contacting allies, perhaps already framing the narrative that would explain her disappearance. Liana did not wait to see which version he would choose. She stepped out into the night. Rain had begun again, fine and persistent, coating the driveway in a slick sheen that reflected the house's lights back at themselves. The street beyond was quiet, too quiet. Vehicles passed at a distance but did not slow. Liana felt the absence of Mark's protection immediately, like a pressure drop in her ears. She placed the carrier in the back seat of her car and stood there for a moment, hands resting on the doorframe, breathing in the damp air. Her heart beat steadily, almost unnervingly calm. Somewhere deep inside her, a line had been crossed that could not be redrawn. She was no longer inside the system. She was outside it, carrying something the system wanted control over. As she drove away, the Hale residence receded in the rearview mirror, its lights cold and impersonal, indistinguishable from any other fortified structure owned by men who believed permanence was a birthright. Liana did not look back a second time. The city opened before her, vast and indifferent. The streets did not welcome her. They assessed her. She passed through districts where she was known and districts where she was not, feeling the difference in how shadows clung to her car and how lights flickered overhead. She realized then that exile in this world did not mean disappearance. It meant exposure. Every choice she made from this point forward would be visible to forces she could not fully map. The clans would debate her value. Some would see her as a mistake that needed correcting. Others would see her as a variable worth exploiting. Very few would see her as a person. The baby slept through it all, breathing softly, unaware that their existence had just fractured an alliance and rerouted a future. Liana tightened her grip on the steering wheel and set her course toward a part of the city that had never belonged to Mark, never belonged to the clans, never belonged to anyone powerful enough to erase her. She did not know how long she would last without protection. She did not know which rules she had broken or how they would be enforced. She only knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had stopped being convenient. And in a city ruled by hidden contracts and blood-bound hierarchies, inconvenience was the first step toward becoming dangerous. Victor Black entered Liana Cross's life without urgency, without spectacle, and without asking permission. His presence announced itself long before he appeared in her field of vision. The city reacted to him the way infrastructure reacts to a pressure shift. Surveillance grids recalibrated. Informal networks went quiet. People who lived by intuition rather than data felt it as a tightening under the skin, a warning that something old and absolute had moved closer. Liana sensed it first through absence. The following cars that had been obvious for days vanished within an hour. The watchers who lingered near her temporary shelter stopped returning. Even the city's background noise seemed to dull, as if something had placed a hand over its mouth. Victor Black did not hunt openly. He did not need to. When he finally appeared, it was in a place deliberately chosen to remind her of scale and hierarchy. Not a safe house, not a private residence, but a converted municipal building once used as a courthouse and now owned by a foundation whose paperwork led nowhere and everywhere at once. The architecture was heavy, brutalist, designed to intimidate through mass rather than ornament. This was a space meant for judgments that did not require explanation. Liana arrived because she had been given no alternative that did not end badly. The message had been precise: neutral location, limited window, child present, no intermediaries, compliance implied safety, refusal implied loss of control. Victor was already there when she was escorted inside. He did not stand to greet her. He did not move at all. He occupied the space the way gravity occupied mass, effortlessly, without negotiation. His appearance was unremarkable in a superficial sense. Dark clothing, restrained lines, no visible insignia. The effect came from something else entirely. His stillness was not passive. It was restrained dominance, the kind that existed whether it was acknowledged or not. Liana felt the pressure immediately. Not fear, exactly, but an instinctive awareness of hierarchy. Her body reacted before her mind could impose resistance. She forced herself to remain upright, to keep her breathing even, to refuse the instinct to lower her gaze. Victor Black noticed everything. He assessed her with the same dispassionate attention Mark Hale had once used on financial forecasts, But where Mark had evaluated outcomes, Victor evaluated ownership. His gaze lingered briefly on the child, long enough to confirm what had already been reported. No visible manifestation, no active signature, potential unresolved. Then his attention returned to Liana. She was not what he had expected. Not because she lacked power, but because she lacked submission. Most people who entered a room with him arrived already adjusted to his dominance, their bodies having made the calculation before their minds could resist. Liana stood wrong. She did not mirror his authority, but she did not bend to it either. She existed adjacent to it, like an anomaly that should not persist. Victor recognized anomalies when he saw them. They were rarely accidents. By the ancient covenants that governed the Night clans, the child belonged to him. Not biologically, not emotionally, but contractually. Bloodlines, asset transfers, and contingency clauses older than the city itself had anticipated scenarios like this. A child born without manifestation to a lineage that required it was not a person in the conventional sense. It was leverage, risk, sometimes currency. And those who touched such leverage without authorization were usually erased quietly. Victor did not erase Liana. Instead, he initiated a review. The process unfolded with surgical precision. Records were brought, not digital summaries, but original contracts scanned and reconstituted from fragments, some of them centuries old, some written in languages no longer taught. Victor moved through them without visible effort, his memory mapping intersections faster than any system. Liana watched as her own name surfaced in places it should not have existed. The mark was subtle, not a brand, not a visible sigil, a legal spiritual linkage embedded in the structure of a transfer document, activated by a sequence of events that should never have aligned. The woman who had died on the highway had not simply named Liana as guardian. She had bound her. The child and Liana were linked by a contingency clause that predated both of them. Victor's interest sharpened. This was not romance. It was not fate in the sentimental sense. It was a clerical error with catastrophic implications. The clause had been designed for a different era, a different conflict. It allowed a non-manifest individual to temporarily carry the custodial burden of an unmanifest asset under very specific conditions. Conditions that should no longer have been possible. Conditions someone had deliberately recreated. That someone had been desperate, or very precise. Victor understood immediately what this meant for the balance of power. If the linkage was allowed to stand unacknowledged, it would fracture existing hierarchies. Other clans would contest it. The child would become a flashpoint. Liana would not survive long enough to be useful. If the linkage was severed improperly, the consequences would not be contained. The contracts were not symbolic. They enforced themselves through mechanisms that did not care about modern sensibilities. Victor did not believe in mercy. He believed in containment. He looked at Liana again, seeing her now not as a problem to be eliminated, but as a variable that could be stabilized. She was still outside the system, technically, exiled, unprotected, unclaimed. That made her dangerous but also flexible. No one had invested in her survival yet. That could be corrected. Victor did not offer salvation. He asserted jurisdiction. By right of ownership, he claimed the situation. Not the child alone, not Liana alone, the linkage itself. He framed it not as a punishment or a reward, but as a corrective measure. The system would absorb the anomaly rather than reject it. The proposal was simple in structure and brutal in implication. Liana would return inside. Not as a wife, not as a dependent, not as a protected ornament attached to a rising man's reputation. She would return as a provisional asset under Victor Black's authority, bound by a temporary agreement that acknowledged the existing linkage without resolving it. The child would remain with her. This was not generosity, it was containment. Under Victor's oversight, no clan could touch her without consequence. Her survival would be guaranteed not because she mattered, but because she was now under his control. The system would tolerate her presence because Victor enforced that tolerance. In exchange, Liana would surrender autonomy. Not emotionally, but structurally. Her movements, her associations, her decisions regarding the child would all exist within parameters defined by Victor and the covenants he upheld. Liana understood immediately what this meant. She would be visible again, monitored, counted. But she would no longer be disposable. The conflict between them did not manifest as attraction. There was no warmth, no pull, no illusion of partnership. What existed was friction between two wills that refused to collapse into each other. Victor did not soften his authority for her comfort. Liana did not perform gratitude for his approval. That tension was precisely why the agreement held. Victor respected resistance that did not devolve into chaos. Liana respected power that did not pretend to be kindness. The temporary nature of the agreement was emphasized deliberately. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was forgiven. The system remained unstable, merely prevented from shattering. When Liana left the building that night, she did so with a different kind of weight on her shoulders. She was no longer in exile. She was no longer free. She had re-entered the machinery that had chewed her up once before, but this time she did not enter through marriage or obligation. She entered through contract. Victor Black watched her go without expression. He did not wonder whether she would survive. Survival was now guaranteed. What interested him was what she would become once pressure was applied consistently. The city adjusted around her again as she stepped back into it, recognizing a new pattern, a new alignment. The clans took note. Mark Hale would learn soon enough what it meant to lose jurisdiction over something he had dismissed as weak. Liana felt the shift immediately. The city no longer pushed her away. It watched her. She held the child closer, aware that she had traded one kind of vulnerability for another. She was inside the system now, but not hidden within it. She was a marked exception. And Victor Black, who owned the rules rather than obeyed them, had decided she was worth keeping intact until the system itself decided otherwise. Liana Cross learned the true price of control not through punishment or violence, but through prolonged exposure to its mechanics. Living within Victor Black's sphere altered her understanding of power in ways no external observation ever could. From the outside, the night clans appeared to function through dominance, bloodlines, and fear made visible. Inside, beneath the surface rituals and enforced hierarchies, the system revealed itself as something far more fragile. It was not sustained by strength, but by constant maintenance, by vigilance, by sacrifice that never ended. Victor Black was not merely an alpha, he was a structural element. His residence reflected this truth with brutal clarity. It was neither home nor fortress in the romantic sense, but a convergence point of authority and contingency. Every corridor had been redesigned more than once, adapted after past failures. The walls carried layers of reinforcement that blended modern materials with sigils so old they no longer belonged to any living language. Nothing here existed for comfort. Everything existed because it had survived pressure. Liana felt it immediately. The building resisted her presence without hostility, as if measuring her impact and failing to categorize it. Security systems adjusted unpredictably around her. Personnel reacted with subtle hesitation, not fear, but uncertainty. She was not flagged as a threat, yet she did not resolve cleanly into any acceptable category. Victor noticed before anyone else did. He never commented on it directly. Instead, he recalibrated procedures. Access routes shifted. Observation protocols changed. He watched how the system reacted to her proximity, how long-standing predictive models produced inconsistent results when she was involved. It was not chaos, it was distortion. Power, Liana realized, hated distortion. Victor's daily existence was a study in controlled erosion. His authority demanded constant engagement. Every decision carried consequences he alone was expected to absorb. Disputes between clans were brought to him not because he enjoyed dominance, but because no one else could afford to be wrong. He was the final reference point, the living clause in contracts written centuries earlier. What struck Liana most was not his severity, but his isolation. He did not delegate responsibility so much as distribute tasks stripped of agency. Others acted, but he remained accountable. He slept irregularly, often in fragments, his body trained to respond instantly to crisis. The physiological cost was evident in ways he did not attempt to hide. Control demanded vigilance, and vigilance eroded the self. Victor did not rule because he desired power. He ruled because he could not relinquish it without collapse. Liana's interactions with him remained restrained, almost clinical. There was no pretense of trust. Their exchanges were precise, bounded by necessity. She resisted his authority reflexively, not out of rebellion, but because submission had already cost her too much in her previous life. Victor, in turn, did not attempt to dominate her. He applied pressure only where the system required it. Between them, formed a partnership stripped of illusion. Over time, Victor began allowing her to observe certain processes indirectly. She witnessed how disputes were neutralized not through punishment, but through memory. Victor retained an encyclopedic awareness of obligations, failures, and compromises embedded in the system. He did not threaten violence. He reminded others of the consequences already agreed upon, consequences they had hoped would never be enforced. Fear existed not as spectacle, but as accumulated knowledge. Liana saw how this knowledge aged him. Each enforcement extracted something intangible but irreversible. Control was not merely exercised, it was paid for. This proximity forced Liana to reassess her own history. Her perceived lack of power had shaped every relationship she had ever known. She had been classified early, quietly marked as a non-contributor to the clan economy. What she began to understand now was that the classification itself had been the mechanism of suppression. Systems designed to regulate volatile abilities had been embedded into clan society long before her birth. They targeted deviation, not weakness. Liana's potential had never manifested outwardly because it had been flattened preemptively. The realization arrived through accumulation rather than revelation. Systems failed to predict her behavior accurately. Surveillance hesitated. People misread her intentions. Even Victor, with all his experience, found it harder to anticipate her reactions. She did not escalate situations. She destabilized them by refusing to resolve as expected. The child responded to her presence in a way that could not be explained by conditioning alone. Calm settled where chaos should have followed. Stress indicators diminished rather than intensified. Whatever Liana carried within her did not amplify power. It redistributed it. Victor understood the implication before she did. He began testing boundaries subtly. He adjusted containment fields. He observed how ancient safeguards reacted to her proximity. The results were inconsistent but undeniable. Liana did not trigger alarms. She bypassed them without effort, not by force, but by existing outside their assumptions. This made her invaluable. It also made her dangerous. The partnership between them evolved under pressure. It was not built on intimacy or trust, but on functional necessity. Victor required an element the system could not fully anticipate. Liana required protection that did not demand her erasure. Their interests aligned only insofar as survival required it. The child became the axis of this fragile balance. Unmanifest, Unclaimed, yet central to converging agendas, the child represented a fault line the system could not seal. Victor ensured the child's safety with meticulous care, not out of sentiment, but because the child's existence destabilized multiple long-standing agreements. Eliminating the variable was no longer possible without catastrophic consequences. Liana recognized what that meant. She was no longer merely protected, she was leveraged. And so was Victor. As their alliance solidified, subtle signs of systemic strain became impossible to ignore. Minor disputes escalated faster than before. Old alliances tested limits they had respected for decades. The night clans sensed imbalance and responded instinctively by tightening control, increasing enforcement, demanding clarity where none existed. Victor absorbed the pressure, as he always had. Liana watched as the cost manifested physically. His movements grew sharper, more economical. He eliminated excess even from himself. There was no indulgence, no retreat. Control demanded presence, and presence demanded sacrifice. For the first time, Liana understood the cruelty of a system that devoured its own stabilizers. She also understood her role within it. She was not the solution the clans expected. She was the variable they had never accounted for, a presence that did not dominate or submit, but disrupted by refusing to conform. Victor acknowledged this without nomming it. Their interactions grew more precise, more charged. They challenged each other's assumptions relentlessly. Liana refused to accept authority as inherently legitimate. Victor refused to accept autonomy without consequence. Between those positions, something fractured. They did not speak of overthrow or rebellion. They did not articulate alternatives. But the mere existence of an unresolved contradiction began to strain the system. Control that could not be sustained without destroying its bearer. An anomaly that could not be erased without destabilizing everything around it. Liana was no longer empty. Victor Black still carried the weight of the night, but now he did so knowing the cost was no longer abstract. The system had begun to crack, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. The city did not wake after the night of renegotiation. It recalibrated. Liana Cross sensed the shift before any formal acknowledgement occurred. The streets remained the same, the architecture unchanged, the nocturnal economy intact, yet the air carried a different density. Not tension, not relief, but adjustment. Like a system that had survived a near failure and quietly rewritten its tolerances. She stood precisely where she had learned to stand best, between domains that did not fully claim her. The final convergence did not resemble a tribunal or a coup. There was no dramatic collapse of authority, no public reckoning. The night clans did not function through spectacle. Their power resided in continuity, in the ability to absorb rupture without appearing to fracture. What Liana initiated did not threaten their existence. It threatened their habits. The old contract had been simple in its cruelty. Lives were currency. Anomalies were collateral. Stability was maintained through substitution rather than correction. When a variable endangered equilibrium, it was removed, replaced, or consumed to preserve the illusion of control. Liana refused to be substituted. She did not arrive at this refusal as an act of rebellion. It emerged as inevitability. Every attempt to categorize her failed. Every effort to bind her to an existing role weakened the system's predictive integrity. She was neither asset nor liability in conventional terms. She was a contradiction the structure could not neutralize. Victor Black understood this fully by the time the renegotiation became unavoidable. The pressure had reached a threshold. Minor disturbances escalated too quickly. Suppression protocols overcorrected. Enforcement demanded more from Victor than his body could sustainably give. The night clans, sensing instability, pressed inward, accelerating the very collapse they sought to prevent. Victor remained alpha, but the cost had become terminal. Liana did not challenge his authority directly. Instead, she introduced an alternative that rendered absolute control obsolete. The renegotiation occurred across multiple nodes rather than a single council. It unfolded through revisions, addendums, silent withdrawals of support, and the sudden irrelevance of clauses that had once governed life and death. Liana operated through presence rather than command. She did not dictate outcomes. She altered incentives. The child ceased to function as leverage. That shift alone destabilized several long-standing arrangements. Without a vulnerable life to anchor coercion, entire chains of obligation collapsed. The clans were forced to confront a truth they had avoided for generations. Their stability relied on perpetual sacrifice, and the supply was no longer guaranteed. Liana offered a replacement structure. The new contract did not abolish hierarchy. It redefined cost. Power could still be exercised, but it could no longer externalize consequence indefinitely. Any action that displaced harm onto non-participants triggered proportional liability within the system itself. The mechanism was not moral, it was structural. Violence became expensive. Exploitation became inefficient. Victor facilitated this transition not as an abdication, but as a recalibration of his role. He remained central, but no longer singular. Authority redistributed into redundancies that did not depend on his constant sacrifice. For the first time since inheriting the position, he delegated consequence alongside power. It aged him less. The night clans resisted in subtle ways. Resistance did not take the form of open defiance. It manifested as hesitation, as delayed compliance, as attempts to test boundaries that no longer responded predictably. The system absorbed these tests and corrected without escalation. Stability returned, but it was no longer silent. Liana's position solidified without ceremony. She was not named alpha, consort, or intermediary in any traditional sense. Titles would have reduced her function to something manageable. Instead, she occupied a role defined by jurisdictional overlap. She moved freely between domains that once required submission or force to cross. Her authority was implicit. She had no bloodline to defend, no legacy to preserve. This made her incorruptible by traditional means. She did not represent continuity. She represented survivability. Victor recognized this and adapted accordingly. Their relationship remained stripped of romantic illusion. Whatever connection existed between them was grounded in mutual recognition rather than possession. Victor did not claim her. Liana did not replace him. They operated as co-authors of a framework that neither could have sustained alone. Trust existed, but it was not blind. Control remained, but it was no longer absolute. The child grew within this revised structure, unclaimed by prophecy, unmarked by expectation. Protected not because of symbolic value, but because the system could no longer justify its consumption. This alone marked a fundamental departure from precedent. Liana observed the city from elevated vantage points, noting how the night adapted. Certain industries recalibrated. Certain enforcers found themselves obsolete. New forms of influence emerged, quieter, less extractive. Power did not disappear. It redistributed into patterns that required consent as much as fear. The cost of this transformation was not negligible. Some clans dissolved rather than adapt. Others fragmented internally, unable to reconcile reduced autonomy with increased accountability. Victor absorbed the fallout methodically, refusing to revert to previous solutions. Each collapse reinforced the necessity of the new order. Liana did not intervene unless required. Her restraint preserved legitimacy. The final contract was not signed in ink or blood. It was encoded into enforcement protocols, jurisdictional thresholds, and conditional access. It existed as architecture rather than agreement. To violate it was not forbidden. It was simply unsustainable. The knight accepted this because it had no alternative. Liana Cross did not emerge as a savior or a ruler. She emerged as a condition, a reminder embedded within the system that survival required evolution, not substitution. Victor Black remained alpha, but the darkness he governed no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to a structure that could endure without devouring its own stabilizers. The city continued to breathe under artificial light and ancestral shadow. Deals were still made. Power still shifted hands. But beneath it all ran a revised logic, quieter and more precise. Liana occupied the space that had never existed for her before. Not chosen by destiny, not elevated by lineage, present because she had refused erasure and survived the consequences. The story did not end with resolution. It ended with definition. She was no longer an object of contract. She was its co-author. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.